Okay, I'm reading from People's book. I was reading the other day, chapter 4, and I'm back today to finish the rest of it. So I don't know if anybody's going to come on. And it's regarding Pete Walker's book on how to deal with complex PTSD and childhood trauma that we've been through in our lives. So I'm just going to start reading, and if anybody does show up, then I will be able to chat and go from there. But here goes. This is about accepting recovery as a lifelong process in complex PTSD from surviving to thriving. Pete Walker says, it is exceedingly difficult to accept the proposition, the fact that recovery is never complete. And although we can expect our flashbacks to remarkably decrease over time, it is tremendously difficult and sometimes impossible to let go of the salvation fantasy that we will one day be free of them forever. So what a lot of people do with complex PTSD, they'll be in a position where they are having flashbacks or getting triggered and going to flashbacks and not understanding what's going on. So for myself, for years, I was going into flashbacks or behaving in ways that I didn't understand were to do with my early childhood trauma. And I would often think that I was being unreasonable with my own reactions to people. But until we understand what's going on, we can't actually heal the core of CPTSD. And again, it's not salvation thinking that it's all or nothing, because we never know when we're going to get triggered. An example, if people have been through violence, sexual abuse, or verbal abuse as a child, somebody might use a tone of voice that just puts you into a flashback, or you might see something on the news which is about trafficking of children or something like that, and it will bring up emotions and feelings for you. And so it's not a cut and dried road, this healing. But the more we know, the more that we have psychoeducation, the more that we step into ourselves and begin to put our shoulders back, regain our self-esteem, have healthy anger, healthy blame, and begin to increase like the joy and happiness in our own lives. We stop being in reaction mode all of the time, but it is a process. So continuing reading. Pete Walker's book, Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving. He says, yet when we do not loosen our grip on the salvation fantasy, we remain extremely susceptible to blaming ourselves every time we have a flashback. Understanding this is so crucial because recovery typically progresses in a process that has many temporary regressions. So a regression is that you're going through life, you think you're doing really well, and then you'll have maybe a nightmare, flashback nightmare or something like that. And then you'll berate yourself for having those. So we've got to be really, the more mindful we get about what flashbacks are, that the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, the more we understand. And below this video, you can got 13 steps for managing flashbacks and 14 tips for managing your inner critic, because the inner critic will have you for breakfast, so to speak. That's a British saying. I don't know if they say it in the USA, but it's where it's almost like your life is overtaken and you just like think so badly of yourself and so low of yourself and have so much self-hatred that you've gone into a flashback that it makes the flashback last even longer and keeps you in a place of feeling depressed about who you are and knocking out your self-esteem and all of the good stuff. And the inner child work is really important from this point of view as well, that when we begin to become our own healthy parent, our own healthy mother and our own healthy father, that we'll protect ourselves and we'll start nurturing ourselves. And then there will be a lot less codependency in our relationships as well. So going on reading, he says, understanding this is so crucial because recovery typically processes in a process that has many temporary regressions. Moreover, most recoveries often have the unfortunate subjective experience that the temporary regression feels as permanent as concrete. This is especially true because of the interminability feelings of flashbacks. When we flashback, we regress to our child mind, which was incapable of imagining a future any different than the everlasting present of being so abandoned. So, you know, as a child, we don't understand there's a future or a way out. But as an adult, we can remind ourselves we are just having a flashback. You know, I had one today. I've had a couple this week, but they've lasted maybe half an hour here and half an hour there. Prior to reading Pete Walker's book, if I had a flashback, it would last for days or weeks or hours, like, you know, 8 hours or a lot longer. So psychoeducation in CPTSD, along with other modalities and with therapy, for instance, I'm currently having trauma psychotherapy. I started it in September 2018, and I'm doing it I've got another, I think, up until February next year. So 2020. So it's not just going to be one thing that's going to solve this problem, but we have to get out of the all or nothing thinking, which happens when people go into modalities or spirituality, thinking that they've just got to forgive or surrender or hand it over to God. And that really keeps us in a place of not being able to grieve properly. It's okay to feel very angry about being abused or going through abuse. Most people that keep currently having, you know, regular flashbacks have not had healthy anger or healthy blame because society does not allow it. And religions also tell us that we've got to, you know, honor thy mother and father. But, you know, for me, I think it's the other way around. When I look at little babies and little children, I've been out and about in the summer, like go and get my coffee, whatever, and I see people holding their little babies. And to me, it's like, parents need to honor their children. That's my view on the situation, and that children who generally are honored and do honor back. So, you know, generally. Continuing reading here, he says, so how do we come to bear the knowledge that our awful childhoods have created some permanent damage? It helps us to see my CPTSD as somewhere as analogous to diabetes, a condition that will need management throughout my life. This is a piece of bad news that naturally feels offensively unpalatable. But the good news is, as with diabetes, is that we can become more skilled at flashback management. So for instance, you know, like if we're going to think we're healed, you know, I'm going to heal from my 30 years of sexual abuse or whatever it was, or the violence that happened. The reality is, you know, last night I went to bed and I had, you know, a nightmare. I had therapy yesterday, then I had a bit of a nightmare, sort of out of body experience last night. So, but when I woke up, you know, it didn't ruin my day because I understand, well, I had therapy, we were talking about this, and then I was able to relate to it and speak to myself and manage it in a way that was not damaging to me. Continuing reading, he says, this is a piece of bad news that naturally feels offensively unpalatable, but the good news, as with diabetes, is that we can become more skilled at flashback management. CPTSD can gradually become infrequently bothersome, and even more appropriately, we can evolve towards leading increasingly rich and rewarding lives. And I have to say that I bought this book in 2017, November. It took me about 3 months to pick it up. I'd pick it up and flip through it, and I thought I didn't want to read this book, but eventually I did. I picked it up and I couldn't put it down. And then I started to evolve in my healing and my feelings. And I would say that my life now is increasingly richer and rewarding, 100%, you know, it's gone upwards. He goes on to say, even better news is that CPTSD, when effectively managed, eventually bestows gifts. And it does, I can tell you that too. It comes with significant silver linings unavailable to those less traumatized, as we will see at the end of this chapter. Then he says, therapeutic flashbacks and growing pains. Healing from childhood trauma is also a long, gradual process because recovering your full self-expression requires a great deal of practice. Being yourself can be intimidating and flashback inducing. Healthy self-assertion was punished like a capital crime in many dysfunctional families. Expressing yourself in ways that your parents forbade typically triggers intense flashbacks at first. Like, for instance, it could be the first time you say no to somebody, like you've been, you know, as a child, you might have been beat round the head or, you know, beaten with a belt or looked at with disdain or, you know, sexually abused and just had to accept what your parents were doing when you were like 2 or 3 or 4 or any age group, 7, whatever age group as a child, any parent that's been offensive in that way, or, you know, it means that we, you know, if we did say no, we probably got slapped harder or treated. You know, when we look at it, you know, a child being sexually abused and they're not able to say no, it is extremely traumatizing. And as an adult, we might then stand up and say our first no to somebody. No, I'm not doing that. Or no, that is not acceptable to me. And the more we heal and we have self-esteem, we will stop the codependency with people as well. We'll begin to attract healthier people into our lives. So there's a lot of benefits to this book, and the links are below this video as well, that you'll be able to, there's some good resources that I put below this video. So I'm going to repeat this bit. Being yourself can be intimidating and flashback inducing. Healthy self-assertion was punished like a capital crime in many dysfunctional families. Expressing yourself in ways that your parents forbade typically triggers intense flashbacks at first. This can cause you to lose sight of this practice. Gradually reduces the chronic pain of remaining invisible. We can encourage ourselves to face these growing pains by conceptualizing them as therapeutic flashbacks. We then choose to weather these flashbacks to stop the past from holding us back, to reclaim the fundamental human rights that our parents denied us, and to finally own what is rightfully ours for the taking. Okay, what have we got there? Okay, I've got a few people on watching. Thank you for being there. No, but unless you comment, I can't see you. So, you know, thanks for being there, whoever's watching. I'm terrible. Okay, Timmy, that can be your homework. If you're reading the book, I think you are the inner critic. You want to get to that. So you want to get to the inner critic bit and read on that. Then he goes on to say, we can further bolster ourselves for such necessary flashbacks by comparing speaking up to going to the dentist for a toothache. Unless we accept the acute pain of the dentist's therapeutic procedure, we will suffer chronic dental discomfort indefinitely. Unless we speak up, the loneliness of our silence will imprison us forever. So we've got to learn to speak up. And as he says about the dentist, I went to the dentist today for a checkup and it was pain-free. So, you know, sometimes we can go to the dentist, and if we look after our teeth, then we can come out with a good result on the dentist. But, you know, that we have to, sometimes going through the flashbacks are often a sign that we've got something that's not healed, and we need to look at that. He says here, recovering from overwhelmingly painful childhoods is also so difficult because we understandably want to avoid any further pain at all. So for many people, we can completely disassociate. You know, for me, for years, I used drinking wine and smoking cigarettes as my part of my disassociation. And I'm 7 years free of alcohol as the 2nd of July, and 4 years, coming up 5 years free of cigarettes. So, you know, it's possible to change behaviors and begin to feel our feelings and stop disassociating. He says, we may even believe that we need to risk a flashback and practice speaking up, but the moment of facing the triggering that silence can so easily avoid, we cannot sometimes help giving up and remaining mute. It's very hard for people to speak up. You know, when I started doing it 2 years ago, somebody really annoyed me, so I did go a bit nuts, but it did me the world of good. I began to speak up and really stand up for myself. Going on, he says, however, if we are ever to recover our real voice, we must sometimes invoke the energy of bravery. Bravery is, in my opinion, defined by fear. It is taking the right action despite being afraid. It is not brave to do things that are not scary. The anger work described in chapter 11 can help you with this enormously. With a strong enough intention, you can begin by occasionally invoking the kind of courage that involves feeling the fear and doing it anyway. You can nudge yourself to do this, to rescue your inner child from the loneliness of never being seen or heard. So it's like, you know, if we're in a queue, it's like, and somebody stands in front of us, we can say, excuse me, I was here first. We can start in small ways, you know, because often in families where this has occurred, there's been complete muted silence of abuses that have gone on, and completely, you know, denial and toxic shame because you're standing up for yourself. We are allowed to speak up. We don't have to be rude about it, but we can put our shoulders back and say, hey, that hurt, and so forth. Going on. Moreover, when we embrace this practice, we will eventually learn that fear does not have to be disabling. We can be afraid and still act powerfully. We can refuse to tolerate never speaking up, never having our say, never stating a preference, and never saying no to set a boundary. With enough practice, therapeutic flashbacks not only diminish, but begin to be replaced by a healthy sense of pride in ourselves for our courageousness and self-championing. More and more, we are rewarded with feelings of safe belonging in the world. Okay. Continuing, he says, it is critical for deeper level recovery that we learn that feelings of fear and shame and guilt are sometimes signs that we have said or done the right thing. They are emotional flashbacks to how we were traumatized for trying to claim normal human privileges. So we can start saying no in small ways to people. It's really important that we have our boundaries and preferences, and that we allow ourselves to be heard. So what that could be like, it could be that you imagine that you have an inner child, and that we have, because we've all got that inner child inside of us, and that we protect that inner child. And if we hear that inner child is not happy with something, we stand up for that inner child. We become the parent of that inner child, and we nurture and we protect. So the nurturing is mother, and the fathering is protection. You're not going to let your child be walked all over or disregarded or mistreated, and you're going to nurture that child to make sure it feels safe and it's okay. He goes on saying, as our recovery progresses, we need to learn to endure these feelings. So we've got to learn to endure feeling a bit scared and a bit, it's okay. We're dealing with human beings. Nobody's above us, so to speak. There's no authority in reality that is above us, but human beings, we've been consensus reality. The way we've been brought up in the world with religious beliefs and spiritual beliefs, we believe there's all these people that know more of it than us or better than us. Timmy says, but it does feel good when I say no, although people like my boss don't like it when I'm not. The usual pushover. Yeah, it's good to, keep reading the book, because it took me a good year and a half to really get into this and stop shaming myself. Then he goes on to say, reinterpreting the deeper meaning of these feelings is key to accomplishing this. Typically, this involves epiphanies like the following. I feel afraid now, but I am not in danger. I was as a child. I feel guilty, not because I am guilty, but because I was intimidated into feeling guilty for expressing my opinions, my needs, and my preferences. I feel shame because my parents rained disgust on me for being me. I say no to these toxic parental curses, and I am proud and right to see how they tried to murder my soul. I love Pete Walker when he says that. He's put it in one for me. I give them their shame back as disgust. As you would a friend. If a friend shames you, we can really stand up for ourselves and just say, hey, that's your stuff, not mine. The disgust any healthy adult feels when he sees a parent bullying a child with contempt, or when he sees a parent heartlessly ignoring a child's suffering. And then he's going on now about optimal stress. I'm just going to close something there. Okay. He says optimal stress. The quest to ongoingly grow and evolve out of my childhood trauma sometimes becomes more embraceable to me when I remember the poet's words. He not busy being born is busy dying. In fact, some of the latest research in neuroscience suggests that we actually need a modicum of stress in our lives. This type of stress is called optimal stress. So some stress is good, but if we're in fight, flight, freeze, fawn all of the time, then it means that a lot of stress can be very damaging, because it will if we get into panic attacks and stress and we're not dealing with our fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, it means that the chemicals hit the adrenals, and then wearing out our organs. So we can really help ourselves by knowing how to handle stress. There are a few tools that, you can tap. and which is one thing that I did to get rid of panic attacks and anxiety. I went through a stage as I was healing where I thought, I couldn't swallow like food, or, something was going to get stuck, and it would freak me out when I was going through these flashbacks. So I just sat there and I tapped and I breathed, and breathing, that brought my parasympathetic system under control. Sympathetic, parasympathetic, fight, flight. And you can find out more on my other videos on that. And also you can visit my ladies group. Sorry for the guys, I don't have a group for guys, but there are groups I know on Facebook for dealing with CPTSD response and anxiety. But for the ladies, I have a group where we can discuss things over there. So, and then my page is public on Facebook as well. So continuing reading on optimal stress. Optimal stress is balanced, moderate amount of stress that appears to be necessary to grow the new neurons and neuronal connections that correlate with keeping the brain healthy. Research shows that just as too much stress creates a biochemical condition that damages neurons in the brain, too little stress leads to death and lack of replacement of old neurons. This is why lifelong learning is widely recognized as one of the few of the key practices necessary to avoiding Alzheimer's disease. And I like he said that there, because I started studying astrology in 2015, and every chart you look at, you're going to have deep, you have to look at it deeply. And it would be like anything, like doing a crossword, or, learning to play music or read music, or trying to understand something. It's helping up new neurons fire, and, it keeps us healthy, keeps the brain healthy. He says here, in my opinion, lifelong recovering is an exalted subset of lifelong learning. I believe that optimal stress is frequently attained when we practice the behaviors that remedy our developmental arrests. So for guys out there who don't know what a developmental arrest is, if a child is abused time and time again and they're not allowed to be themselves, they're not allowed to say no, they're not allowed to stand up for themselves, they're not allowed to have preferences, it means that they'll shut down and they'll stop having those needs, and they won't go to a mother or a father and say what they need. So it means that as an adult, we then get involved in relationships where people might be abusive or unkind, or it may not even be that we meet unkind, abusive people. It's just that we won't assert ourselves, because when we did as a child, we were abused for asserting ourselves. So it becomes what's called developmental arrest. He says here, examples of this include reading self-help books, this is one that I'm reading, self-improvement workshops, working at a deeper level of self-recovery through journaling, or struggling to be more vulnerable and authentic in therapy sessions, or an evolving relationship. So we can have evolving relationships for friendships, but we have to make sure there's no abuse there. And if there is, we need to stand up for ourselves. He then says, moreover, it might be that minor flashbacks sometimes function as optimal stress. I certainly know a number of long-term recoveries who seem to be evolving and becoming sharper in their old age. And I can account for that. I've become a lot sharper in the last couple of years as I stopped drinking, stopped smoking. I've not had processed sugar for a month. I eat healthier. I've got my brain fired up with all of this astrology I'm learning and the books I'm reading and so on. And then he talks about silver linings in CPTSD response. He says, we live in an emotionally impoverished culture, and those who stick with a long-term recovery process are often rewarded with emotional intelligence far beyond the norm. This is somewhat paradoxical, as survivors of childhood trauma are initially injured more grievously in their emotional natures than those in the general population. So I add, he says, 1 in 3 girls suffer through sexual abuse, violence, verbal abuse, physical abuse, and 1 in 5 boys on average. And the figures are from this book. So I don't know where that came from for him, but clearly that's a huge population of the 7.5 billion of us. Then he says, the silver lining in this, however, is that many of us were forced to consciously address our suffering because of our wounding was so much more severe. Those who work an effective recovery program not only recover significantly from emotional damage, but also evolve out of the emotional impoverishment of general society. One of my clients described this as becoming way more emotionally intelligent than the normies. So I'm not laughing at people who've not had, trauma, but clearly we've got to see that, I was forced into having to look at my wounds after a breakdown in 2016. And it's given me a lot more compassion for people who've been through trauma as well. So there are a lot of silver linings in this, and it means that I've got the ability to help other people as well. Hi, Bray, I can see you there. And hi, Donna, I see as well. Okay, I'm going to continue. He says, perhaps the greatest reward of impoverished emotional intelligence is seen in the greater capacity for deeper intimacy. Emotional intelligence is the foundational ingredient of relational intelligence, a type of intelligence that is also frequently diminished in the general populace. And we see that because a lot of people who've not been through trauma, they'll want the normal things in life. They'll get sidetracked and disassociated with, going out partying, wanting to buy a house, and not ever looking at their feelings, just wanting 2.3 children, blah, 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 all of that stuff. They're not really having to dig deeper. And that's not making fun of people. It's just, be aware out there. If you've got Ptsd response, you work in this and reading this book and getting the help you need is going to help you to evolve into much more than you could possibly ever imagine. So he says, as stated earlier, intimacy is greatly enhanced when two people dialogue about all aspects of their experience. This is especially true when they transcend taboos against full emotional communication, because there's a taboo in society about fully expressing ourselves. Like if you've got a problem, you've got to get over it. It's in the past. What's wrong with you? Blah, blah, blah. All of these things people say that are meaningless. Or, the biggest meme going around in spirituality is let it go. And we hear it everywhere. It's just, it's phenomenal. It's just meaningless. When we fully process something, guess what? We let it go. So I tend to tell people to, they need to process things. We don't just let things go unless it's minor. And then, of course, that's something else. So feelings of love, appreciation, and gratitude are naturally enhanced when we reciprocally show our full selves, confident or afraid, loving or alienated, proud or embarrassed. What an incredible achievement it is when any two of us create such an authentic and supportive relationship. Many of the most intimate relationships, checking I've got the next page correct, many of the most important relationships that I have seen are between people who have done a great deal of freeing themselves from the negative legacies of their upbringing. Then he says, the unexamined life is not worth living. That's a saying, by the way. This is not Pete Walker saying that. I can't remember who said it, but it's a well-known saying. The unexamined life is not worth living. I should know who that is with all of the books I've been reading, but I can't remember. He says, a further silver lining in recovery is the attainment of a much richer internal life. The introspective process, so fundamental to effective recovery work, eventually deepens and enriches survivors' psyches. Ongoing mindful exploration of all aspects of our experiences helps us to firsthand what Socrates, that's who said it, meant when he said, the unexamined life is not worth living. So Socrates said that. He then says, the survivor who follows the introspective road less traveled becomes increasingly free of compulsive and unconscious allegiance to unhelpful familial, religious, and societal values that were instilled at an impressionable age. The recovery now gets to choose her own values and reject those that are not in her own best interest. So what we're looking for is what is in our own best interest. We can go around listening to other people who've not been through abuse, giving us advice about letting it go and all of that, but what is in our own best interest? Often we can turn to people who have not got the answers, and then we can feel so down on ourselves that we can't just forgive and let go as they're suggesting. But we have to remember the people that generally are dishing that out have not had the experience we've had. Going on, he says, in Joseph Campbell's words, the survivor learns to follow his own bliss. He is freer to pursue activities and interests that naturally appeal to him. He evolves into his own sense of style. He may even feel emboldened to coif and dress himself without adherence to the standards of fashion. He may even extend this freedom into his home decor. In this vein, I have seen so many survivors discover their own aesthetics, as well as increased appreciation of beauty in general. How this contrasts with many of the homes of my normal sports buddies, whose homes are often sparsely decorated as if they are too afraid to put something out or up unless it's really cool. As the survivor recovers the right of free choice, she or he becomes more open to trying new things, healthy things that mainstream society, next page, might consider uncool or even taboos. Here are some examples of this that I believe are conducive to both recovery and healthy everyday living. Voluntary simplicity, improved diet, meditation, alternative medicine, broad-scale compassion and environmentalism, deeper emotional communication, and a broader use of the grieving process. The survivor who pursues long-term development on his journey of recovering generally achieves greater overall evolution than the average citizen. For many untraumatized people, the pursuit of ongoing learning often stops after their first formal learning experience, whether that is high school or college. Introspective development also rewards the recovery with more perspective and wisdom in making important life choices. It also improves his everyday instinctual choices, such as whether to fight, flight, flee, freeze, fawn in times of real danger. If you don't know what that is, look below. You'll see 13 steps for managing flashbacks and 14 steps for dealing with your inner critic, because the inner critic has to go when we're dealing with the CPTSD response. It's really, really important to get rid of the inner critic that tells us that we're nothing and that we're not good enough, or we're not pretty enough, or we're not, man enough, or whatever this inner critic, because that is not our voice. We are all unique individuals, as each rose is unique, and all the beauty that's around us. There is perfection, imperfection, and beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And we have to really begin to love ourselves and mother and nurture and father ourselves where that did not happen for us. And it's a journey, it's not all or nothing. He goes on to say, finally, another silver lining often achieved in later stage recovery is a greater ability to handle normal pain in the most healthy and least re-traumatizing way. By normal pain, I mean the reoccurring essential pain of all human being experiences. From time to time, via encounters with loss, illness, money troubles, time pressures, such painful encounters can produce emotional reactions like anger, sadness, fear, and depression. So all of those feelings, are normal, and we berate ourselves when we had them. Earlier, I think, I felt a bit sad for a few hours, and I thought, I feel sad, and I was okay with that. I wasn't berating myself, and now I feel okay. So we're going through, our moods. The average person has not learned how to verbally ventilate and metabolize their feelings about such events. This results in them getting stuck in painful emotional experiences, or especially depression, for inordinate amounts of time. So the thing that we can do here is that when we feel sad, or we feel angry, or we feel, that we want to be done with somebody, or whatever it is, we can just accept that this is the way I feel right now. I feel really peed off with that person. I don't like this. I don't like my job, or whatever it is. It's like, just in that moment, just don't berate yourself for having these normally healthy feelings. People want to jump into being grateful and do that law of attraction stuff. It doesn't work with CPTSD. And this is a whole different thing we're dealing with. Going on. He said, the emotional imperialism of don't worry, be happy. This is the great one for all of the people who think that the universe has our back, And I often think to people when people say that, well, through my 13 years of sexual abuse, the universe certainly didn't have my back then. So, we need to stop all of these, not stop them, but be aware that these sayings can be highly inappropriate for some human beings. and particularly people that have been traumatized in childhood. So then he says, the emotional imperialism of don't worry, be happy. One reason that recovering survivors attain greater emotional intelligence is that they eventually see through the mainstream media's indoctrination that people should be happy all of the time. Page 2, next page. Much of the general populace, however, becomes increasingly dissociated from their full emotional experience by anxiously pushing to pump up their mood. Many normal people strive to fulfill the pursuit of happiness as if it was a patriotic duty. More and more, they employ socially acceptable addictions to accomplish this. Snacking, spending, self-medicating, and online puttering are widespread addictions that seem to be ever on the rise. A particularly rampant example of unhealthy mood-altering behavior is porn addiction. Addiction to pornography creates a terrible narrowing of consciousness. So in many men who are afflicted with it, it commonly destroys their capacity for real intimacy. Tragically, the use of porn is more and more normalized, and we can look at that in society. You know, this isn't judgment. It's just like, let's look at what's going on around us. You know, there's all this sexual abuse, and then we've got all of these people, you know, the porn is being pushed out there in, you know, social media and, you know, Google and whatever. It's quite tragic. It is tragic if we think about it, because it stops people having normal relationships or loving relationships as well. And people then live in fantasy about what a relationship is. He says, tragically, the use of porn is more and more normalized, even in many psychological circles. He says, here are two enlightening references in the latter subject. So he gives a couple of web pages here, which I'm not going to read out. Then he goes on, as we become more emotionally intelligent, we free ourselves from the hysteria-inducing pressure to continually pump up the joy in our life. Please do not read this as an ode against joy. It is a blessing to have our natural fair share of laughter and feeling good. But I believe it is also a blessing to resist the growing emotional imperialism that demands that we become fountains of joy. We are assaulted daily with messages from advertisements, from laugh track saturated TV shows, and from new age enlightenment gurus who shame us into believing that we are less than if we are not constantly bubbling over with ecstatic Disneyland-like enthusiasm. The pressure to be always up was an enormous shame-triggering thing for me for decades. He said this, yeah. Sadly, I increasingly see clients and friends struggling with self-contempt for not being happy enough. Then he says, once again, I am certainly not knocking joy, but when it is inauthentic, it is disconcertingly sad and sometimes alienating. In worst case scenarios, a controlling narcissist can emotionally blackmail us to join him in falsely emoting joy. Just as painful is when we codependent force ourselves to laugh to cover up our own fear of shame. This is also not to say that authentic joy cannot be contagious. Contagious joy is a wonderful experience of being positively triggered into shaming someone's authentic delight. For an experience of this, he says, go to YouTube and check out this, he says, about children laughing. I think it's a video like that's been going around. I've seen it before. I might put the link below that he refers to that here. Anyway, he says, in my experience, it seems that authentic joy is much more common in the lives of well-parented children. I also do not think that joy is typically as dominant an emotional theme in an adult life unless it is synthetically induced with drugs or alcohol. So a lot of people, you know, they've got jobs they hate and they, you know, it's not judgment again. They'll go and drink, you know, and they'll can't wait till Friday. Friday's the day to feel good. And then, you know, they think they're really happy and then they have to go back to their horrible job on Monday. And it's like people aren't really living because of, you know, they're not looking at what's going on. And if we remove the synthetics, you know, which I did, I removed sugar, processed sugar on the 1st of June from my from my life, and I could feel this, you know, this gnawing inside of me for something. It's like it felt like this lacking of something. And the more I've got used to it, the more I can see, what is that feeling? You know, what am I desiring? What am I missing? Before, I just like have a bit of cake every night, and now I've stopped doing that. And I feel like continuing it was supposed to be for 30 days, but now it's turned into 42, I think. How, wow, I'm impressed with myself. Anyway, there you go. So then he goes on to say, I also do not think that joy is typically as dominant an emotional theme in my adult life unless it is synthetically induced with drugs or alcohol. On the other hand, experiences of joy for survivors can gradually become more frequent as the person's recovery efforts promote increasingly feelings of safety in the world. So it's about getting to feel safe. So if we get our healthy anger and blame and get rid of our toxic shame, get rid of the inner critic, sounds really easy, but it's hard work, and we begin to stand up for ourselves and put our shoulders back and be a force in the world, then we'll begin to have more joy. I have joy now when I go and get my daily coffee, all sorts of things, but I'm allowing myself my full emotional scale. I'm not cutting myself off anywhere. Then he says, as our emotional intelligence increases, I see considerable evidence that our expectation of joy becomes more reasonable. This allows us to let go of permanent happiness as the unrealistic goal of recovery. Until this happens, we remain at the mercy of the critic's contemptuous talk that we are not being joyful enough. One of my clients recently became mindful enough to see how he was shaming himself for not being as jubilant as those in the beer commercials. As a concluding comment to this overview, it is important to emphasize, like most things in life, there are degrees of CPTSD. The continuum of CPTSD ranges from mild neurosis to psychosis, and from highly functioning to non-functioning. Its severity ranges from having extended periods without flashbacks to being in full flashback horror much of the time. This range also varies from a condition of increased experiences of thriving to a condition of barely surviving, which is, you know, disabling for people. We're all at different levels. Like at one point, you know, 2 years ago, 2016, I could not get out of bed. You know, I could just about feed myself. I lost 20 pounds in weight. My hair started falling out. I went into a flashback that just hit me. But that allowed me to really begin to dig deep into my problems and deal with, I wouldn't say my problems, but to look at my wounding. And it really helped me to begin to flourish and stand up for myself and start looking at my preferences and saying no to people and being a bit feisty and all the rest of it. So the book link is below, and it's free on Amazon, Audible USA, and it's free on Kindle UK Audible. So you can check those links out. I've got a bit more to read here. He says, progress in recovery is seen then in flashbacks becoming more manageable and life satisfaction becoming continuously more frequent. A friend of mine once joked with me, I've got so much more recovery, I'm beyond normal, I'm super normal. I made the normies look like they're the ones with CPTSD. We have to giggle. There's humor in healing. Then he says, and we end the overview, we are ready, as we end this overview, we are ready to move to the next chapter, which explains how varying childhood trauma histories can cause CPTSD. Here, we will also see how verbal and emotional abuse alone can cause CPTSD response, and how profound emotional abandonment is typically at the core of CPTSD. Right, that's my reading for today. I'm going to have a cup of tea. It's like after midnight in London. I'm wide awake, but I'm going to go and have a cup of tea and finish off what I'm doing. And thank you for whoever's watching out there. And I will be back, I think tomorrow, I'll be back with a bit more, and over the weekend as well. And if you've got any questions for me, you can always come over to my like page on Facebook or my personal page, or go to my ladies group if you're a lady. Okay, catch you later. Good night.